Latin America's once richest country, sitting atop the world's largest proven oil reserves, is an economic basket case, a humanitarian disaster, with a dictatorship whose demise many believe cannot come soon enough. But is it socialism that's to blame for the widespread starvation, critical medical shortages, an explosion in crime, and a refugee crisis to rival Syria's? You're likelier to read that this crisis is the product of corruption, cronyism, populism, authoritarianism, resource-dependency, US sanctions and trickery, or even the residues of capitalism itself. I'm Darren Grimes, Digital Manager at the IEA, and joining me to discuss is the IEA's Head of Political Economy, Krisitian Niemietz, and the Daily Telegraph's Assistant Comment Editor, Madeline Grant. Thank you both for joining me today. If we look at how closely Venezuela followed the orthodox socialist script, how can these people argue then that this wasn't socialism if they followed the script as close to the bone as they possibly could?
That's because socialist apologists are also following their script as closely as they can, and their script has been the same for 100 years, which is to fawn over a socialist experiment as long as it seems to work. There's always this honeymoon period, which lasts for a little longer than a decade, and then suddenly getting defensive when that experiment starts to fall apart, and then in the end saying, oh no, actually that was never really socialism. And Venezuela has been going through those exact three stages and followed that script to a T. The honeymoon period was between roughly 2005 and 2013, because 2005 was the time when they started explicitly referring to their policies as socialism, when they started bandying the term socialism of the 21st century about. And 2013 was the death of Hugo Chavez and the end of the oil price boom. So that's when the economic crisis that they're still in today started. But you could still plausibly make excuses for a while, so that's why you had this period of excuse-making, whataboutery for 2013, 14, 15. Then everyone suddenly fell silent on the subject. Venezuela just dropped off the world map. And then in 2017, you had people saying, oh, actually, that wasn't really socialism. You had, most famously, John McDonnell saying they have not followed socialist policies. That's why they're in trouble. Had Noam Chomsky, who was previously praising it, saying, oh, no, I never said Venezuela was socialist. Far from it. And a couple of other commentators. And weirdly, over the past few days, they seem to have had a relapse, our Western Chavistas. Now it seems that it is suddenly socialism again, and we're back to this period of making excuses, blaming so-called sanctions.
Why do you think that is, Maddie? Is that because they recognise that actually if the winning argument is that this was socialism and actually it's been a complete catastrophe, a humanitarian catastrophe, they can't make those arguments in this country?
I think one of the reasons that on this particular occasion, the last 2 weeks or so of turmoil, one big difference is that someone else that they really hate Donald Trump has decided to recognise Maduro's official opposition as leader of Venezuela. So that's meant that's given, I think it's revived something of what we saw a few years ago when US sanctions were repeatedly blamed for the extent of the problem, even though as Krisitian alluded to earlier, they came in after years and years of socialist policies anyway, and the growth was already massively stalling when the sanctions were imposed. But I think that it's meant that they can now fend off the uprising that's taking place within Venezuela as something that somehow is the product of US ideology, when in fact it's simply the US, adding their voices to a very long list of supporters of the opposition, including the EU and including lots of goodies.
But just one more note on this. I'm not a linguistic pedant. If somebody says, actually, socialism is not 100% the correct term, it would be more accurate to call it statist populism or left-wing populism, something like that, I'm okay with that. I'm not the one who insists on calling it socialism. The point is, though, that plenty of prominent Western socialists for more than a decade have said, yes, this is socialism. Yes. So it wasn't us who put that label on it. It was Jeremy Corbyn, for example, in a couple of days after Chavez's death, said Venezuela or Chavez has shown us that there is a different and a better way of doing things. It's called socialism. His words, not mine.
And in fact, not similarly to some of the field trips that were taken by Western socialists or British socialists in the time of communism out to the USSR to go and see this fantastic project in progress. There were quite a lot of high-profile figures on the far left, and actually some of whom are now manning the front benches of the party of opposition, actually made trips out to Venezuela to go and see what was going on. I think because the feeling was that this was the start of the next new great thing. And Krisitian has written extensively about this trend of these countries having a kind of vogue period, and then they fall out of favour, and then they seamlessly find a new country to attach all of their beliefs to, and Venezuela was just one of the more recent iterations of this.
But Krisitian, surely the reason for this is because it did start out as genuine socialism, but then US sanctions are what put the nail in the coffin of the socialist project.
Well, then these would have to be sanctions with a magical retroactive effect, because Venezuela has been in a perpetual state of crisis for at least 5 years, arguably more than that, depending on which measures you want to look at. And the sanctions have only come in 1.5 years ago, when they were already in freefall, when their economy had already contracted by a third. And it was only then that those sanctions came in. And I think there is a reason why people on the left only talk about the sanctions in the abstract without spelling out which measures they're actually referring to. Because if you look at it, those sanctions are still pretty minimal in scope. All it is a ban by the US government, a ban on purchasing Venezuelan government bonds. And that also applies to bonds issued by the state oil company. But there is no trade ban, for example. You can trade with Venezuela as much as you like. You can sell them food, medicines, industrial equipment, anything you like. There is no investment ban either. You can invest in Venezuela to your heart's content. The only thing you can't do is buy government bonds. And even that is only true if you're a US citizen. So you, as a British citizen, you can buy wheelbarrows full of Venezuelan government bonds. If not that I'd recommend it,
no, yes.
But legally you're perfectly entitled to do that.
But do you think then there's an argument though that this move by the US, and I'll put this to Maddie, to strangle the Venezuelan government and economy will actually inflict punishment on the entire population and exacerbate the already severe humanitarian crisis in the country? Isn't the failure of Venezuela down to this kind of meddling?
No, no, very much not. It's down to massive expropriation of property for going back to, when was it, 1999 that the socialist government came in. In addition to which you have this spiralling hyperinflation that is reaching, unprecedented highs. And there's actually, I would recommend everyone follow on Twitter, there's a guy at Johns Hopkins University called Professor Steve Hank, and he actually traces inflation on a day-to-day basis. And some of the leaps that you see only in 24 hours are just extraordinary. And this level of hyperinflation has left Venezuelans unable to buy basic products, basic consumer goods, even when they're available, which they're very often not. It's created this huge black market in dollars. And I think, as Krisitian said, the scale of the sanctions has been pretty minimal. And in blaming it on the US in any way, shape or form is just a desperate rearguard action from a group of people who are still desperately trying to justify their ridiculous beliefs.
Yeah, the problems of the country already started in the early 2000s. It was primarily when they brought in price controls. That was microeconomic interventions more broadly. That was what started the whole process. What happened then was that as soon as they brought in those price controls, they started to see shortages. And surprise, surprise, it was always the price-controlled goods. It was never just random goods. It was always those. And rather than accepting that this is not the way to go, the Chavez government then railed against the private sector actors affected by this and went further, saying if you don't keep producing and keep selling under price controls, even if you're making a loss, we're going to expropriate you. And in a lot of cases, they actually followed through with this and actually did that. Mm-hmm. And that was the big game changer. So Venezuela before Chavez was not a free market paradise either. It was always an interventionist economy in which the state played a huge role. But a big difference was that Venezuela before Chavez, even though it was interventionist, stayed broadly within the framework of the rule of law. So they respected property rights, they respected independent courts. It was never a banana republic. That's what it became with Chavez. This idea that you just point at someone and saying, I don't like what you're doing, I'm going to confiscate your property. That was a big game changer. And that was exactly the part of it that that a lot of the Western Chavistas were most keen on. That was the part that they were praising. There is a video of Owen Jones, for example, where he talks about the housing program, and he says the cement producers refused to cooperate with the government, so they nationalized them.
But Maddie, if the US, the argument that if we sort of put to one side this argument that the US is responsible for Maduro seizing companies, for price controls, for an over-reliance on oil, for state attacks on the free press and opposition, and for the millions fleeing without food and water and basic medicines, we can't argue that's socialism, can we? Because what about Denmark?
Oh, yes. So what about Denmark?
So Denmark is often put across as a argument for socialism in action. This is what socialism can look like. This is what socialism in Britain could look like.
Oh, I see. So I guess this is again the kind of rearguard action that I mentioned. Before it became so unignorable, the scale of this humanitarian crisis, as you say, it's something like an estimated 2 or 3 million refugees. So it's on the scale of the displacement of Syria. When these repercussions of the regime became so difficult to ignore, then people again retreat and say, well, we never argued for this. That this is the group of people who actually have decided to step back from Venezuela. They said, well, we never argued for this. We were simply arguing for, the Swedish model or the Nordic socialism, which is problematic because these are actually very free market economies that happen to have high levels of wealth distribution kind of after the event. So they're not in any way comparable. But I think that the majority of people who were arguing for Venezuela a few years ago have now moved off of that quite sensibly because they know that it's a losing battle. I think there is a remaining coterie of very extreme left-wingers who will continue to make the case for Venezuela. But it's very important that the work that Krisitian and others are doing in going back over these people's old blogs and Guardian pages, and in the case of Jeremy Corbyn, an article that was actually on his website that was since removed. But if you go back on the kind of time machine thing, you can see the iteration of it in 2013 or whenever it was published. It's really important that people really hold these voices to account, because some of what's happened in Venezuela is not dissimilar to some of the things that are being proposed for economies in Europe.
Yes.
So it's very important that people are aware of them. Krisitian talked about price controls. That's a classic example of the kind of, I suppose, well-intentioned government intervention that has completely perverse consequences, because you haven't thought about what the unintended outcomes of this kind of this approach might be. So, for example, price controls. You cap the price of essential goods like flour. What does that do? It makes Venezuelan companies, it makes it no longer viable for them to produce flour and so on. And so this leads to food shortages.
And on the Denmark point, it is worth pointing out that as long as Venezuela was in fashion, the cheerleaders of that system defined it explicitly in opposition to European social democracy. There is, for example, a Seamus Mill article where he says Venezuela proves that it is no longer necessary to accept a failed economic model, as most European social democrats still do. So he didn't explicitly mention Denmark, but what else would he have had in mind? He was probably talking about the Blairites in the Labour Party and the Nordic-style social democracy that they would previously hold up as the model that they're aspiring to. And that makes sense on their own terms, because if you want something radically different, then of course you would look for, you would be attracted by places like Venezuela. Denmark, in reality, is just not really that different from the UK. Their welfare spending is a bit higher than here. Public sector spending and the public sector itself is a bit larger, but it is not a fundamentally different economic and social model.
And Seamus Milne is obviously Jeremy Corbyn's well, what is his
Guru.
title?
His guru,
Yeah, guru.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And the other thing I would raise about the Nordic models is that very often, if you actually look at the makeup of their economies, they often have very high levels of private infrastructure provision. So it happens to be state funded, but it's delivered by private companies. And can you imagine the outcry? For example, we see it all the time whenever people recommend, an NHS that remains free at the point of delivery, but there may be extra private provision for efficiency gains or something. And that is, treated with absolute horror and hysteria by the left. They are not arguing for, a Swedish education system with vouchers and 30% delivered by the private sector. They just aren't.
Yes, indeed. Well, yeah, an education system once advocated by the likes of Milton Friedman,
Exactly.
for example.
Yeah.
And Denmark has a private ambulance service. I mean, in that sense, yes, I also want to be more like Denmark, but I doubt I'm going to make a lot of friends with this.
If you want to find socialism in action, you either have to look at a genuinely authoritarian regime in another part of the world, or you have to look, in the words of Thomas Sowell, in institutions where ideas do not have to work in order to survive.
Yeah.
The point is that this idea will always lose the battle of ideas, and ultimately people will move to reject it. Why else would you have a Berlin Wall if not to keep people out and prevent them from leaving? In these systems, people will vote with their ballot box, and failing that, they will vote with their feet and leave. So it's hardly surprising that it relies on authoritarian machinery in order to sustain itself.
Are you as optimistic as that, Christian? Because if you have all of these sort of hard left cheerleaders who are coming out in The Guardian, etc., to write about the fact that this was real socialism, but it's down to US sanctions that it has not come into fruition. The grand project has not worked because of the United States of America. Are you worried that in both the US and the UK, the left, the sort of leader of the opposition even, are making these sorts of arguments? Do you think actually our side of the argument, free market, pro-market, will win the day in the end?
It very much looks like they're getting away with it once again. Actually, it is, from their own perspective, a rather risky strategy to weigh in on this again, because, as I said before, they had actually... The British left had already fallen out of love with Venezuela 2 years ago, or in fact until pretty much 5 days ago or so. The mainstream argument had become Venezuela was just never really socialist. It has nothing to do with us. And the deleting of articles that had all been underway already, and so far it's succeeded. It's already it has reached that stage where it is almost considered tedious to bring up Venezuela, where people would say, why do you have to keep banging on about this? Let's move on. Let's talk about food banks in Britain. And from their own perspective, it is a bit risky to now weigh in again and defend that regime again. But yeah, they certainly got away with it the first time, retroactively reclassifying it as real socialism. I hope that at least rescuing it in those terms, saying it would have worked brilliantly had it not been for US sanctions. I hope that at least with that they won't get away, because otherwise it could be remembered in a way the Allende government in Chile in the early 70s is remembered today, where you also have this myth of martyrdom, saying this was a government of a democratic socialist, and it got ruined by U.S. interference and later on their own military. But even there, that experiment was already falling apart. They already had food shortages and hyperinflation. The Allende government in its last year was already like Venezuela today. It was like Venezuela without the oil. Well, it was almost literally Venezuela without the oil.
Now, my last question, what next? I mean, what is the best outcome for Venezuela now? How do we rebuild a country that has suffered so much and is suffering so much? Do you think there's hope on the horizon? Do you think this is the end for Maduro's regime?
Well, it's very difficult to say. I think a lot will depend on which way the army in Venezuela choose to go, whether they decide to support the successor and to what extent they will get behind him. I think that there is the danger, I suppose, that if there was a great deal of Western intervention at this stage before any kind of overthrowing, there would either be an element of, well, as happens with other interventions, you broke it, you bought it sort of thing, and also less important than the practicalities and the life of poor Venezuelans. But there would also be the Americans ruined our experiment.
Yes.
It might get remembered in that way. But I think the situation is so dire now that it cannot persist as it is currently for that much longer. And I suspect that there will have to be some very large stimulus package of relief money and some new economic management, hopefully, to start to steer through the wreckage of this terrible, terrible regime.
Krisitian?
Yeah, I'm a bit wary about the point that it's so terrible, therefore it cannot persist. I remember people saying that about North Korea in the late 90s, and look at it, they're still there. But I can't talk about the political dynamics, I don't know. But at least if they somehow manage to get rid of Maduro, then at least Venezuela has a democratic tradition that they can fall back on. They used to be a republic for decades. They have a much longer democratic tradition than most of Latin America. And getting rid of the absolute worst parts of the crisis, that should be relatively easy. What they need to do is, first of all, a currency reform to overcome the hyperinflation. They need to do something like what the Weimar Republic did in 1924. They sorted this out pretty quickly once it was understood what was going wrong there. So that can be done. And they need to get rid of all price controls and exchange rate controls. That's something that you could do overnight.
Yes.
But rebuilding that trust in institutions, showing that we are no longer the banana republic that we were in the Chavez-Maduro years. We will respect private property rights. You can invest here. That will take a long time to rebuild that.
Well, here's hoping it's the end of Maduro pretty soon. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.